My name is Lance Nagano. I am chairing this event. I would like to introduce Mike Schott, the Executive Director of Cabrillo Marine Aquarium. He's going to tell you a little about sustainable seafood.
Thank you, Lance, and I'm so glad. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad Lance didn't say like he did with my other president. Oh, he did say briefly, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. The message that we have today is to learn about choosing the seafood that you eat wisely. And what we mean by that is doing it in a way that's sustainable. That means that what you're eating today doesn't jeopardize what we want to eat in the future. Not only for the populations of the animals that we eat, but for the environment that they live in. So if somebody were to be farming an animal, like a shrimp, right on the seashore and wiping out mangroves in the meantime, that's an example of something that's not sustainable. That's not what we're interested in trying to promote for you to go and order. So if you go away from today, and here's the message we're hoping that you think about. Where is my seafood coming from? When you go to your restaurant, where does this seafood, do you serve sustainable seafood? When you go to your favorite grocery store and you order fish, where or is this fish sustainable? If you can say those things when you go away from here, we've done our job for now. There's a lot more work to do, but let's start that conversation. So thank you so much for being here today, everyone. And now we're going to be listening to a chef giving us some suggestions on how to cook some oysters. I can't wait. Lance.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to introduce Pete Lehmar. Pete Lehmar, soon after graduating from the CIA, found himself living in France and working in various kitchens catering. No, he wasn't a spy. CIA is Culinary Institute of America. It's a very prestigious culinary institute in New York. He landed back stateside in California, working for the Westgate Hotel, Carmel Highland Resort, the Water Grill, and advanced executive chef of McCormick and Schmick's, before opening Gladstone's Long Beach, where he's been the executive chef for over 10 years. One of his great passions and accomplishments is winning seafood chowder competitions, taking first place twice in the Best of the West Chowder Fest, 5 times victorious in the Monterey Wine Festival and West Coast Chowder Championships, twice in Creative Chowder and Seafood Chowder. Unfortunately, he won't be preparing chowder today, but he will be showing you how to shuck and prepare an oyster properly. Chef Pete?
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for being here. Thank you. It's kind of funny, you know, this whole word sustainability came up like in the 90s. We didn't know what it was. We just knew that people were out there taking a lot of fish and basically ruining the ecosystem of wherever things were happening. So I hope you learned a lot today. I couldn't think of anything more sustainable than an oyster. And it's a really nice drive going up north out of San Francisco and running into Hog Island and Tomales Bay and these places where they have these oyster farms. And you start talking to these people and they literally have like 6 million oysters that are out there. Some are ready for market and some are going to grow over the course of 6-8 months. But that's sustainability at its finest right there. Going back to the 90s, what I remember about the 90s, working in the kitchen, Chilean sea bass. Everyone had Chilean sea bass? Okay. I remember when the fillets were coming in like this big in the back door, and as the years went by, they just got smaller, and you can't even get it. I remember in the 80s that orange roughy was on everybody's menu, and now you can't even find it anymore. So we're doing everything that we can at Gladstone's. I know all the chefs here are doing everything they can to help with the sustainability of our planet and our oceans by doing the right things. I buy most of my fish from Hawaii, here off the coast of California, and I also bring it in from Alaska. And all these places do things to govern their bodies of water. Halibut season has a season for that reason. If they let them fish it year-round, we wouldn't have it, but they do cut the season. Copper River King salmon out of Alaska, a short season, monitored. They want to make sure there's fish going back upstream to replenish the next generation of the stock. So, but sustainability to me, the perfect thing is the oyster. It grows everywhere. I've got some Pickering passages from Washington. I've got some Black duck salts from Long Island. Arcadia delights are from Virginia. And I also have some Misty Points from another spot in Virginia off of Hope Bay. These are the ones I'm serving over there. I think people are intimidated by oysters because they don't know how to open them. By the way, who loves oysters? Yeah, exactly. Did you know they go with cheese? They go into stuffings. Oysters Rockefeller, yes, no, yes, yes. Okay. It's not just eating this one piece of protein by itself. That's everything. It's also all the things you can do with it. So again, sustainability. Here's a protein that you're going to see as we move forward in the future. There's going to be more oyster farms along the coast here in California. And you're going to start seeing oysters in farms along the coast of Africa, helping to take care and feed all those people that are over in Africa who don't have enough food. Oysters are going to be the thing. So it's going to be real interesting to see what kind of recipes get developed as we move forward in the future with oysters. So basically oysters, there's two kinds primarily here in the United States. We have a West Coast oyster, also known as a Pacific oyster, and he's usually more deep cupped than oysters from the East Coast. The East Coast tend to be called, they're called the American oyster, they're called the Eastern oyster, and they're also called flat oysters. And you can see that this one's flatter than this one. Maybe if I show it like this, that helps a little bit for you to see how, you can see how this is a flat oyster, this one especially, compared to this one. So West Coast, East Coast. They all have a hinge. There's a hinge right here, and what this guy does is he just filters water. The seawater goes through him and he just filters it, and his body absorbs all the nutrients that are in the water. Iodines, the copper, everything that's in the water, little daikons, and that's how he gets his unique flavor. So he has a hinge that he works off of, and the only thing you have to do is just pop that hinge, and his muscle is attached to both the bottom of the shell and the top of the shell on the inside. You can't see it because I haven't opened this yet, but I will show that to you. And it's the same for all of them. You can see there's a cup, there's a nice big hinge, and I hope you can see that one. See that hinge there? And that's how this guy works. An oyster knife. There's 100 different kinds of oyster knives out there. There's some that are little short, blunted, things like this. Over in Europe, they love those because they love to go into the side of the oyster. And trust me, I was in France and I tried to do it and I couldn't do it. I know how to open up oysters my way. So you'll see all kinds of different kinds of knives and stuff like that. One thing I always wear is I always wear safety gloves. It's just a habit. Because when you work in a kitchen, it's fair to say that everyone's cut themselves on a slicing machine once. And then you have respect for the slicing machine. Everyone's cut themselves with an oyster knife once. You can ask that guy back there. Yes. And all of a sudden, when you've done that, you respect the knife more. I like to wear plastic gloves. All these things are easily accessible. So it's just a little protection for me, because I think the challenge behind an oyster is the shells are brittle in some places. And if you take this knife and you see people doing this one, and this is not how you open an oyster in my book. You see them take this thing here barehanded, they start wedging this knife in here and they start pushing and pushing and pushing. Well, I weigh 200 pounds and I put 200 pounds behind this knife and this shell gives way. It's going right through my hand. So that's how you don't open an oyster. So you keep the oyster cup side down. You look for the hinge right here. And this knife, my favorite kind, he's got a little bent tip. I don't know if you can see that or not. The blade's just kind of straight, but then it bends at the end here. And what I like to do is I just like to wedge that right into the hinge. And once I get that in there and it's good, it's solid, I kind of just brace it and I turn this and you can hear it pop. I should hold it here. But it pops, and as soon as it pops, I'm now going to run the knife along the ceiling of the top shell. And he comes right off like that. And now I've got this meat here. And I'm going to clip the other muscle that's right underneath here, and I'm going to flip him over. Try to flip him over. Something like that. So there you have that one oyster right there, ready to go. You can slurp him, you can garnish him with lemon and Tabasco. We can do anything we want with that oyster. So here's another oyster here. You can see there's a little hinge right there. And once again, all I'm doing is I'm sticking point of that knife in there to hinge and kind of just letting it work its way in there. See how it's fragile? That's what you have to be careful of when you do this. And then you can feel it pop. And once again, the blade over the top. And that's where the muscle was attached. And now I've got this oyster here like this. I've got some debris here, broken shell. Clip the oyster underneath here. And there you have another piece of meat inside the oyster there ready to go. I love oysters. Does everybody here just absolutely love oysters? So I talked about 2 different kinds of oysters, and it was real interesting. I gave a lecture on oysters several years ago, and I realized, well, there's only one kind of oyster primarily grown on the west coast of the United States, but yet it seems like there's like 200 different kinds of oysters. There's Fanny Bays, there's Chef Creeks, there's Pickering Passage, there's Hog Island and Tomales Bay. Well, they're all the same species of oyster. Well, what makes them different is they grow in different water conditions. Some places are colder, some places have more different kinds of nutrients running through the water, and that's the reason you have all these differences. So if it's just kind of like, everybody here drink wine? Okay, so you go to the store, and you have 75 bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon that are up there, and they're made from all over the world. Cabernet Sauvignon being the grape, but every bottle tastes different, but yet it's always the same grape that was made from. Well, for me, it's just like the oyster. Yeah, there's 200 kinds of oysters coming down the coast, but they're actually all the same species, but they all taste uniquely different. So please go out there and eat oysters and learn to love them even more than you do now. And let me open some more of these. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, no, maybe so? You do. No, you don't. So that was it. I wish I could bring this next to my microphone so you hear if you could hear this thing pop. There you have it. We have oysters. Talk to me. Yes, he's asking about, is there a noticeable profile within the oyster, being that these are from the west coast and these are from the east coast? And the answer is yes. And amazingly, people who eat oysters on the east coast tend to really love their east coast oysters and not really care too much for the west coast, and vice versa. You find in the east coast, you taste a lot of mineral at the end. It's got a very mineral finish, but a desirable mineral finish. And they're all a little bit different between these 3, but there is that distinct mineral finish. Whereas the west coast oyster tends to have things like lettuce and cucumber and melon as a sweet finish to the oyster. When the oyster first hits your mouth, you think it's really, really salty. And it's for like 1,000th of a second, you're like, oh my God, it's salty. No, it's not. Now you start to taste the oyster. So for me, don't put anything on your first oyster if you've never had it before. Eat the oyster as is, okay? Try some different oysters and do it without the lemon juice and the cocktail sauce and the horseradish, because all you're doing is masking the actual real flavor of the oyster. If you like that stuff, great, but try the oyster by itself first. And did I answer your question, gentlemen, sir? And then here's that west coast one. Again, I'm just sticking the knife into that hinge. I don't know how that looks on the screen here. Just wedging it in there, just getting a firm grip, and just listening to it. See, it's a fragile shell. And just listening to it give. See, this one completely demolished on me here. And that's why I'm glad I wore the safety glove, because this thing would have just cut my hand had I not been wearing it. So get a glove and don't be scared. Don't be scared. It's not going to hurt. What's funny is I think I've actually cut this hand more than the hand holding the oyster, only because when it does give, my hand will then run into the shell. And the shells are brittle. They're real fragile. They're pretty sharp here on the edges, so you do have to be careful. But I did break this one, and that happens. At Gladstone's, I try to always keep at least one East Coast oyster on the menu and 2 West Coast oysters on the menu, but it changes. Right now, if for those of you who've been to my booth, I was supposed to serve an oyster from the West Coast today, and unfortunately the waters are too warm out there for them to make their harvest, so we had to make a quick maneuver, and we got some East Coast oysters that we're serving at the booth today. But at the restaurant, I always have 3, maybe 4 different kinds of oysters, and you can come in and you can order a mixed plate, if you will, and you can definitely distinctly taste the difference between all the oysters. So again, you know, it's just about using that tip.
So if you're to buy a bag of oysters, what do you look for when you buy them and you want to shuck them at home?
All shellfish come with shellfish tags. The tags tell you 3 things: the name of the oyster, where it was harvested, and the date that it was harvested. So you know it's fresh. So typically in the restaurant business for me, I get shellfish tags, meaning I'm buying oysters that are anywhere between 2 days and maybe 4 days. I try not to get anything past 5. Is 6 or 7 okay? Actually, it is. Oysters, you know, if you go back to the 30s and the 40s, they used to put these things in big boxes and ship them all over the country by train. So, you know, parts of the country weren't getting oysters until they were 10 days old. And there was still nothing wrong with them as long as you kept ice on and you kept them cold. But for me, I tell my guys, we try and keep everything inside 5 days, and we turn them over in the restaurant inside 2 easily.
Out of all of those, which one's your favorite?
I'm sorry?
Out of all of those, which one's your favorite?
I still didn't hear.
Which is your favorite oyster? Which is your favorite oyster?
My favorite oyster, I like them all as long as they're fresh. I think that, you know, it's fair to say that, you know, oysters, every oyster has a story. For me, my wife and I, we took a drive a couple years ago north of San Francisco. We got onto the one, and like I said, we're driving along. I didn't know Hog Island, Tomales Bay was there. And all of a sudden there's these signs, and I was like, I got all excited. So maybe my favorite oyster is Hog Island and Tomales Bay, because we pulled over and immediately started eating oysters for the next 3 hours. I've been, yeah. I remember once, I have family over in France, and my uncle and I, we went to the coast. He actually lives like, say, 90 minutes from the coast, and we went there specifically to get oysters for his birthday party. Well, we've got 4 bushels of oysters in the back of the car, and we pulled over on the side of the highway and shucked half of one of the boxes with a bottle of wine right there, and just sat there and talked for 2 hours. So that's my favorite oyster too.
And there are
every oyster has a story.
There are 120 oysters in a bushel, to let you know how many oysters that is.
There's a what? 120 West Coast, 100 on the East Coast. So these are packed by 100. Then you got specialty boutique oyster farms that have a limited production, if you will, and they'll pack them at 60. And then the other nice thing that they do is they say 120. The guy actually tries to throw like 124 in there, because he knows that as you're shucking, every once in a while you're like, that one's got to go in the garbage. So there you go. Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, how do you know if an oyster is not as fresh as you describe? And then some restaurants, it almost seems like they wash the oyster or put it in a water, so it's almost very watery. Is that a common practice, or?
I can answer your question so good, right? First thing is, if the restaurant can't tell you where the oyster came from, don't buy it. Don't eat it. If they're just throwing this random, I don't know where they came from. I've been in a place where the guy says, oh, these are Melpac oysters, and he's holding this. I go, this is not a Melpac oyster. Okay, so that's my first bit of advice. The second one is, I did get upset with a restaurant manager one time because he ran my oysters underwater. I go, what are you doing? I'm an oyster lover. I want that liqueur that's in there, right? So he's washing, and he tries to tell me that by law you have to do that. I go, no, you don't. No, you want that liqueur, and you want to know where the oyster came from. You ask him where did it come from, and you can ask him for the shellfish tag. The restaurant's required to keep that for 90 days.
Any other questions? Pete Lehmar, thank you very much. We all
learned
welcome,
a lot. And thank you, folks. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Enjoy the rest of the. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. We still have tasting. There's still plenty of seafood out there, so enjoy.
We saw a talk recently about a professor at Cal State.